I want to welcome you to the 2024 Grace A. Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecture. First, I would like to thank the dedicated facilities folks here at SUU who have been laboring diligently to keep up with the snow. It's been challenging for everybody, but thanks to them. I'd also like to thank the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values and their staff, Dr. Danielle Dabrowski and Professor Nano Taggart. The SUU Faculty Senate Committee, the Tanner Center wanted me to mention that while the Tanner Center hosts this lecture, the faculty or the Distinguished Faculty Lecture is decided by a committee of faculty senators. So it is vetted pretty aggressively, and they did a great job here. We'd also like to thank Dean Jean Bereen of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I'd like to remind you all today that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the Eccles A.P.E.X Radio Hour podcast. Douglas L. Ipson is an assistant professor of music history and theory here at Southern Utah University. He received a PhD in music history at the University of Chicago after earning a bachelor's and master's degrees in music from Brigham Young University. A specialist in 19th century Italian opera, especially its political aspects, he has been published in the Cambridge Opera Journal and is a contributor to the Cambridge Verdi Encyclopedia. He is preparing the critical edition of the opera La Battaglia Legnano, I think I got that right, for the works of Giuseppe Verdi, published by the University of Chicago Press and Casa Ricordi. His other areas of scholarly interest include Shakespeare and opera, the 16th century Italian madrigal, and opera in Revolutionary and Napoleonic France. He is also a composer and arranger whose works have been performed across the United States and internationally. He is a native of St. George, Utah. His lecture today is entitled A Napoleonic Whodunit: Can an Opera Help Crack a Centuries-Old Case? I would like to note that there will be a reception for Dr. Ipson directly after this lecture in the lobby. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Douglas L. Ipson to the Eccles A.P.E.X stage.
I appreciate you all coming out today and braving the elements. I'm especially grateful that my family came up from St. George to support me. On the morning of 10 October 1800, Laura de Pimond debated with her mother and her fiancé, General Jean Junot, whether to attend a premiere at the Paris Opera that evening. The general seemed particularly opposed to the idea, insisting that the new opera and the weather were both expected to be bad, and that an evening out was hardly worth the effort. You may have similar feelings this morning. As he grew more determined in his opposition, it became obvious that Junot, either from direct knowledge or presentiment, feared rather more danger in the theater than a mediocre production. But Laura's mother, who reportedly once entertained a marriage proposal from Napoleon himself, would not be moved, and the three of them that evening trundled off to the Théâtre des Arts in the Rue de la Loi, now the Rue de Richelieu. This is the Paris Opera of that time. It's actually two Paris operas ago, no longer stands, but the building to the left is the National Library, which still very much is there. There's now a park there if you visit the site in Paris. The general's fears notwithstanding, the performance went off without disruption, or at least without unusual disruption. There was a brief pause when the first consul Bonaparte, still flush from his recent triumph at the Battle of Marengo, arrived at the theater late and was welcomed by warm applause as he entered his usual box, which his secretary Louis Bourrienne tells us was on the left side of the hall between the columns that separate the front and side boxes, as you see in this engraving, which comes from a history of the theaters of Paris from the 1820s. None of this was out of the ordinary, however. Few in the theater besides those who accompanied General Junot would have suspected anything was amiss. Shortly before Napoleon buttoned up his signature gray overcoat over his green cavalryman's uniform and departed the theater, the general was called away from his box by an aide-de-camp. Returning moments later, he tearfully exclaimed to his relieved party, "The poor man has escaped death. The assassins have just been arrested." In the coming days, a ragtag group of artists and Jacobins of Roman, French, and Corsican origins were charged with a plot to stab the first consul to death at the theater. After a 3-day criminal trial and a review by the Court of Cassation, 4 of the alleged perpetrators of this so-called conspiracy of daggers were convicted and on 30 January 1801 were guillotined. You see them there on their way to the scaffold. But how guilty were they? From the beginning, anti-Bonapartists raised doubts about the criminal process, portraying the accused as little more than patsies goaded into conspiracy by an agent provocateur in the employ of Napoleon's ruthless minister of police, Joseph Fouché. In the words of one hostile publication, 4 victims were selected, the most dangerous of the Jacobin society, all men of conspicuous talents. Such were the devoted objects destined to be immolated to the shrine of consular authority. The minister of police and his myrmidons were put in motion, and the Grand Opera was fixed on as the scene for the pretended assassination of the first consul. In their later memoirs, Fouché and Bourrienne conceded the role played by the prosecution's chief witness, an apparently disgruntled former officer named Jacques Harel, in concocting and executing the scheme. It was decided, Fouché claimed, and to this I was a stranger, that the conspirators should be entrapped into a snare which Harel was ordered to devise, in procuring them, as he had promised, 4 armed men who should be employed to assassinate the first consul on the evening of the 10th of October, while present at a performance at the opera. Fouché's insistence that he knew nothing of the affair, unconvincing on its face, is flatly contradicted by Bourrienne, who asserted that the minister personally authorized the gunsmith to provide arms to Harel. Dueling recollections like these are all too typical of the period and pose real difficulties to unraveling what actually happened in October 1800. In a dispatch now held in the British National Archives, a Parisian agent reporting to Heinrich Wilhelm von Stamford, a Dutch diplomat who helped coordinate intelligence for the British Secret Service, identifies the problem with public accounts of the alleged conspiracy. The first consul wanted the secret kept as to particular details, he writes, but they leaked out anyway. Moreover, this event has produced no other effect than to fuel conversations. You're actually looking at a secret spy report from 1800, which has long since been declassified, but it's not every day you get to see a document from the British Secret Service. At the time, the first consul tended to downplay the conspiracy in both public and private correspondence, no doubt for prudential reasons. Decades later, in exile on the island of St. Helena, he is on record expressing diametrically opposite opinions on the danger posed by the conspiracy. Memoirs of Napoleon's intimates come well after the fact and are further tainted by their authors' axe-grinding and face-saving, to say nothing of their ghostwriters' limitations and biases. But what if historians until now have largely overlooked a vital piece of evidence that might shed additional light on the events of 10 October 1800? I refer to the opera performed that evening, Les Horaces, by the Roman composer Bernardo Porta, on which a few words of historical and cultural background are in order. The opera depicts an episode in ancient Roman history much beloved during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. According to the most famous version of the legend, by the ancient historian Livy, the triplet sons of Horatius, the Horatii, were selected to fight for Rome's liberty in a proxy duel against 3 warriors from the city's rival, Alba. Although 2 of the Roman brothers were slain in the combat, the third was ultimately victorious over their opponents. The myth attracted new interest after the sensational success of Jacques-Louis David's monumental painting, The Oath of the Horatii, at the Paris Salon of 1785. In his picture, David imagines the moment when the three brothers swear an oath to defend their homeland by extending their hands toward the swords held up by their father, as their wives and children shudder in anxious grief on the right of the canvas. In time, the painting would become an emblem of the revolutionary period itself, while the brothers' gesture would claim an even farther-reaching and by no means entirely positive legacy, as anyone remotely familiar with the history of the 20th century is bound to notice. 15 years after the exhibition of the painting, Porta's Parisian opera would recreate the painting as a tableau vivant, a living picture. There can be no doubt that an association between the painting and opera were both intended and understood at the time. In a memorandum to the management of the opera, probably written in 1814 and now held at the French National Library, Porta describes the concluding scene of Act 2 as the oath of the Horatii by David put into theatrical action. The scene in question unmistakably evokes specific elements of David's painting. The libretto by Nicolas François Guillard, who reworked the text he had earlier prepared for Antonio Salieri, yes, that Salieri, calls for the three Roman brothers to swear an oath to conquer or die in defense of Rome. This oath takes place, as David's apparently does, in a hall of the family's palace, though the opera omits the three women and the children of the painting and substitutes, in an obvious concession to operatic convention, a chorus of Roman knights. The stage directions for the scene that appear in the manuscript score preserved in the archives of the Paris Opera, but not significantly in the printed libretto, make the connection even more explicitly. Just before the Horatii swear their oath, the directions in the score for the elder Horatius read, Il prend les épées, he takes the swords. At the moment the warriors swear their oath, they read, En attitude en formant le tableau, in the attitude of forming the painting. No one in that Parisian audience could have missed what was going on. A review of the premiere in the Moniteur Universel, the French government's official newspaper, noted that the pencil of the choreographer has followed with perfect fidelity for the Oath of the Horatii, the fine painting by David. And a vaudeville parody of the opera at the Théâtre des Troubadours, entitled Les Voraces et les Curieux, roughly The Voracious and the Tenacious, satirically restaged the tableau with turkey feathers substituting for the swords. As it happens, Porta's relationship to both David and his painting was much closer than that of a remote admirer. We learn this from the legal proceedings against the accused conspirators in 1800, during which David was called as a defense witness in behalf of Giuseppe Ceracchi, a celebrated sculptor who moved in the same Parisian artistic circles. Ironically, one of Ceracchi's subjects was Bonaparte himself. You can see a portrait there, both of Ceracchi and then an engraving of his bust of Bonaparte. In the course of his testimony, David affirms a friendship with Porta of long standing, one cultivated during his years of study in Rome, 1775 to 80, and on his subsequent trip to complete the Horatii Commission, 1784-85. David testified, "Citizen Porta is a maestro of music whom I met in Italy. I must go back a bit further. I met him on my first trip to Italy, and on my second also. I told him, 'My dear Porta, if you want to come live with me, I'll take you.' I took him with me. He became known for his talent in music, created various works, and each time he suggested, as is customary, that I distribute tickets to the premiere performance among his friends so that they could applaud. Porta created the opera Les Horaces and gave me the tickets for my students. Not being able to go, I charged one of them, Casanova, to distribute them among his friends, and I don't know to whom he gave them." Surely then, Porta was among the first in the world to view David's canvas when it was first exhibited in Rome in July and August of 1785, and may have even seen it as a work in progress. Moreover, David's statement, "I took him with me," suggests that the two men traveled together to Paris the following month, en route to the salon that would secure the painter's fame. David had sent the painting ahead of him. By 1800, David had become a passionate Bonapartist, and it is reasonable to assume that Porta shared something of his friend's enthusiasm. After the general sat for a portrait in 1797, the painter rhapsodized to his pupils, "Finally, my friends, this is a man to whom they would have raised altars in antiquity. Yes, my friends, yes, my dear friends, Bonaparte is my hero." David would never complete the portrait, which now hangs in the Louvre, but after the consul's stunning victory at Marengo in northern Italy in June 1800, he set out to memorialize him as a modern Hannibal in The First Consul Crosses the Alps at the St. Bernard Pass, on which the artist was hard at work by 1801. Appearing as it does during this same period, it is tempting to view Les Horaces as a companion piece not only to the Horatii, but also to this later painting. The two exactly contemporaneous works press ancient worthies into service as analogues for the man of the political moment. With respect to the Horatii myth, Napoleon himself contributed to its reappropriation as a patriotic symbol during his Italian campaigns in the 1790s. In one of his earliest bulletins in 1796, those notoriously propagandistic reports that helped engineer his rise to power, he praised the demi-brigades under Colonel Antoine-Guillaume Rampon, who, he claimed, swore an oath to die in defense of the redoubt of Montelegino near Montenotte. Bonaparte's praise of his subordinates was, like his simple soldier's uniform, a calculating affectation of modesty. Having read his bulletin back in Paris, one legislator held up the oath of Montelegino as an example of French valor worthy of official acknowledgement and encouraged the Council of 500 to have the incident engraved and widely publicized. He continued, "All deeds, all talents must recall their ancient origin, their first purposes. The sacred bards from Tertius and Ossian to the Marseillaise, the painters from Apelles to the painting of the Horatii, the musician from Orpheus to the one who sounds the Chant du Départ, that's a patriotic French song of the era, must have felt through divine inspirations that wearied their souls, that their songs, their brushes, their lyre belong to their country, to courage, and must celebrate the magnanimity, virtue, and heroic actions worthy of the veneration of posterity." Multiple engravings of the Montelegino oath were indeed created, including this one, printed in politically neutral Nuremberg, that clearly mimics David's Horatii, as you can very obviously see there. In their commendation of Rampon, the ruling directory recommended that the oath be repeated occasionally by all Republicans who are worthy to take it, that it might serve to fortify, if necessary, their hatred of slavery and the desire to conquer the enemies who have not yet renounced the mad project of putting them in chains. 2 weeks after Montelegino, in conversation with the Piedmontese envoy dispatched to negotiate an armistice, a victorious Bonaparte himself compared the maneuver he used to separate the Piedmontese from the Austrians in order to beat them in succession, to the combat of the youngest of the Horatii, who outran his 3 enemies in order to weaken them and slay them, one after the other. Were Porta and his librettist aware the consul had made such a comparison? Significantly, the opera's other highlight, besides the oath scene, was Act 3's elaborate choreographic reenactment of the combat of the Horatii, in which professional dancers stood in for the singers. Like David's St. Bernard Pass, Porta's Horace, then, is likely a naked appeal to French patriotism and the first consul's vanity, in the shadow of his spectacularly successful Second Italian campaign. Or, as the art historian Edgar Wind put it, the choice of the opera's subject was undoubtedly meant to honor the first consul as a son of the revolution. That Porta could think of his opera in precisely such propagandistic terms is demonstrated by the previously mentioned letter to the management of the opera, in which he probably wrote amid Napoleon's recruitment efforts in early 1814, on the eve of the coalition occupation of Paris that would force his first abdication. Obviously out of money and begging for a revival of Les Horaces, Porta insists that this work is perfectly suited to the order of the day, and that the oath scene in particular is made to electrify all the French and cause them to rush to arms should their country require it. With that background in place, I return to sketch the events of 10 October, 1800. Napoleon's recent military success did not endear him to all Parisians, and throughout the later part of 1800, the city hummed with plots and rumors of plots on both his right and left flanks. Like Damocles, Stamford's secret informant wrote, Bonaparte continually sees the sword suspended by a hair above his head. Foreshadowing later events, a group of men were arrested in September for planning to assassinate the consul. According to an intelligence report sent to William Wickham, the founder of the British Secret Service, and now held at the Hampshire Record Office, some 42 conspirators, the number is almost certainly inflated, armed with daggers and pistols, intended to kill Bonaparte as he emerged from the theater. On 10 October, a police report detailed 2 scurrilous works that had recently appeared in the city. The first item, a song distributed by the Exclusif, extreme Jacobins, and directed at the ruling consulate, struck an unambiguously threatening tone. Now tell us in good faith, tyrants of France, sirs, how long will you make the law? When will we reverse our fortunes? Is it not enough to govern? Any longer would be fatal for you. Capet, meaning Louis XVI, also wanted to reign. You know the rest as well as we do. Originally created in 1795 to denounce an earlier government, the Directory, the song can be reconstructed from police documents and a tune book of the period. So here is the reconstruction of that song, and I thought it would be great if we actually could hear what this song sounded like. So you all are probably the first ever to hear this song since probably about 1800. The performance here is by my very talented colleague, Dr. Andrew Briggs. I'd also like to thank our student Caleb Martinez for helping us with this recording. The piano accompaniment in this recording is my own invention, but I assure you I tried to sound as 1790s as I possibly could in recreating it. We can get the audio. There a reason I'm not getting the audio? It always works in the sound check. Let's try this again. What device? So, get the taskbar. The speaker icon. The settings right by speaker. Okay. Any thoughts? I have one idea. One moment. I'll move on a little bit. We'll come back if we can. The second piece reported to the police on 10 October was a satirical royalist play. Its scabrous title and content have led some to ascribe it to the Marquis de Sade that took no less direct aim. Caesar was assassinated because he claimed the title of king. The word alone provoked his assassins, for he already had all the honors and power. The consul will not find in France a Brutus or Cassius unless it is among the Jacobins. Do you think we have it? From the podium microphone.
La dites-nous de bonne foi, messieurs, retirants de la France, jusqu'à quand ferez-vous la loi, quand ferez-vous le tour donner la chance. Ne c'est pas assez gouverner, plus longtemps vous serez funeste. Qu'A.P.E.X aussi voulu régner, qu'A.P.E.X aussi voulu régner. Comme nous savez le reste, comme nous savez le reste.
Another audio clip later if there's a problem. Dr. Briggs is here somewhere. I'd like to acknowledge him for his performance. He sounds like a very convincing Jacobin in that particular recording. So political tensions were high when Porta's Horace premiered at the opera. The most detailed and influential account of that evening, written more than 5 decades after the events in question, comes from a history of the Paris Opera by a French music critic who wrote under the pseudonym Castille Blaze. Quote, "A conspiracy hatched a long time earlier against the first consul Bonaparte was to explode on 10 October 1800. The conspirators chose the hall of the opera to execute their plan. The playbill announced the first performance of Les Horaces, and the leaders of the plot found a way to attend the last general rehearsal of the opera. The most imposing scene, the piece that was bound to captivate the most attention of the public, the chorus of the Oath, located in the second act, was designed by them as the signal which would simultaneously spur into action the band divided into their several positions. 60 conspirators were to arrive at the opera, each on his own, to be placed in boxes especially reserved or among the crowd of spectators. The first act was to go by and nothing was to disturb the tranquility. During the intermission and the beginning of the second act, the conspirators were to take the posts to which they were assigned. 2 were to position themselves next to each of the lamps, lighting the corridor of the first row of boxes, and they were to extinguish them all at once as soon as the Horatii and the chorus struck up the ensemble of the Oath. In the third and fourth rows of boxes, a greater number were to await the same line to launch a barrage of rockets and firecrackers, which they had filled their pockets with, pieces with which they were to light by means of phosphorus boxes, incendiary pieces whose noisy brilliance would strike terror into the crowd and the actors, for they would then direct their firecrackers at every spot in the hall, even at the stage, shouting, "Fire, fire, help, I'm being murdered." At that moment, a panicked terror would spread through the hall. The blazing projectiles would cause cruel injuries. Everyone would make his way all at once to the hallways. There would be a tumult, a melee, which would be even more horrible when this terrified crowd waved its way into the middle of the darkened corridors. The conspirators charged with attacking Bonaparte's box were to stab the 2 sentries, force open the door with the grenadiers' guns, and strike to death the first consul and his 4 or 5 companions. Castille Blaze's irresistibly vivid narrative, which has every indication of being the product of oral rather than documentary history, if not hearsay and legend, is problematic in a variety of ways. Some details are easily discounted. He clearly exaggerates the number of conspirators, probably conflating this incident with the September conspiracy. Other details were disputed at the time of the crime. That the conspirators carried incendiary devices of some sort, intending to use them to create confusion in the hall, was reported in the contemporary foreign press and flatly asserted by Stamford's agent, who boasted that his version of events was the most reliable and correct. Reports of this sort were so widespread, in fact, that defense counsel seized upon them in order to taunt the prosecution, who never actually charged the defendants with intending to start a fire. They did, however, concede their clients were carrying phosphorus matches. The authorities, who were terrified of a fire spreading from the theater, to the adjacent National Library, and so may have chosen to downplay the elements of the case in order to avoid giving potential copycats any ideas. This illustration shows plans that were drawn up for what could be done in the case that a fire started at the theater and spread across the street to the National Library. It was a terrible idea in the first place to put a theater right next to the National Library. A mistake they would not replicate in later buildings. As for Castil Blase's most sensational claim, I have searched through the legal proceedings, police reports, the memoirs of those present and otherwise involved, British intelligence dispatches, and an array of press reports on both sides of the channel, and can find no mention anywhere of any connection to the Horace oath scene. In fact, I cannot find any source before Castil Blase that makes the connection at all. Even so, given the strategic conspiracy of silence that envelops the conspiracy of daggers, the idea cannot be dismissed out of hand. In fact, the published legal proceedings provide at least indirect support for Castil Blase's claim. The prosecution takes pains multiple times to establish that the defendants Arena, Diana, and Cheraki were arrested in the foyer or the corridors outside the first row of boxes during the second act of the opera, the act in which the oath scene occurs, a curiously specific detail otherwise irrelevant to the substance of the case. Napoleon's St. Helena memoir adds the delightfully self-serving detail that the consul on his way to his box boldly passed right by those who had shown themselves most eager to assume their posts, presumably Cheraki and Arena. The most interesting piece of evidence, however, may be the manuscript score itself, which contains two distinct versions of the oath-swearing scene. The oath occupies the slow introduction of the quartet and chorus that concludes the act. The longer of the two versions, which we examined earlier, while not terribly distinguished, is not without effect, and reveals at the very least a competent professional hand. Porta takes care first to build tension over 26 measures, indulging along the way in some rich Beethoven-era harmony until the three Horatii finally arrive at Nous jurons, we swear. At this point, the orchestra explodes in a fortissimo blaze, the strings sawing away in furious tremolo, and the full brass section blaring the horns with their bells in the air. The instruction you can see in the score, Levez les pavillons, which means literally raise the bell. If you want to see what that would look like, it would be something like this from a painting from the 18th century. After another blast, the noise subsides so that the warrior's crucial de vaincre ou de mourir, to conquer or die, can be heard distinctly over the reduced texture of strings and woodwinds. A final outburst prepares the ensuing march in an appropriately spirited tempo. And I think you might want to hear this, but I might need help with the audio here in just a moment. Annie? As I said, it's not a particularly great piece of music, but it would, at very least, keep our Theory 3 students occupied. Altogether, the ensemble is effective enough to have merited the praise of a contemporary critic. The oath of the second act is written in a superior style. It is, on the whole, vigorously composed as well. It aroused real enthusiasm. In contrast, the second version of the scene, contained in the manuscript, is, artistically speaking, an unmitigated disaster. At 10 measures, it is 1/4 the length of the other version, and thus far too short to serve as a proper introduction to the march. The concluding 2 measures of loud hammer strokes strike the ear as unprepared and unconvincing, awkwardly introduced by the sudden wrenching into a unison texture in the previous measure. Oops. I think you can all hear that one really is a disaster. The ending just comes completely out of nowhere. It's completely terrible. Yeah, and I don't think it takes any particular musical awareness to recognize that's 30 seconds long. The poetic text is no less disastrous. Whereas the longer version, which more or less corresponds to the printed libretto, consists of an orderly 6-line stanza of clean Alexandrines, the all-important 12-syllable line of French poetry, plus the occasional 8- and 10-syllable line. This version comprises a single couplet, an 8-syllable line, and an ungainly hypermetrical Alexandrine. That's all a very complicated way to say that the second version is doggerel. It is absolutely terrible. And so an Alexandrine has to consist of 2 perfect 6-syllable units. In the short version, what we end up with is a line that has 6 syllables plus 7 syllables. Nobody writes anything in 13 syllables. This latter line is, in fact, a redundant and clumsy reworking of one sung moments earlier. By the elder Horatius. The copyist has even carelessly neglected to make the appropriate change of pronoun for the 3 sons. Surely they should sing nous, us, not vous, you. The peculiarity of all of this cannot be overemphasized. No self-respecting French poet, certainly not one of Guillard's standing, would be a willing party to such careless hackwork. You all know the line from My Fair Lady, the French don't care what they do as long as they pronounce it properly. There's a lot of truth to that. Apart from its musical and poetic deficiencies, the shorter version omits everything that makes the other dramatically compelling. Gone are the emphatic swearing of the oath, accompanied by a thundering outburst from the orchestra, the stage directions mimicking David's painting, although there is no reason the pantomime could not still have been performed, and the revolutionary slogan, "To conquer or die." All signs point to the shorter version being a mutilation of the longer, rather than the longer being a revision of the shorter. Since the short version of the scene is so incompetent, it is difficult to account for its existence on artistic grounds. Nor is it of such forbidding length or difficulty to require such radical cutting. Someone seems to have intervened for other reasons, but what might these be? In my experience, amateurish revisions like this most frequently result from the demands of government censors, usually to remove politically inflammatory material. Indeed, in 1840s pre-unified Italy, the Oath of the Horatii in another opera by the Neapolitan composer Saverio Mercadante was subject to precisely this sort of censorship, an effort by nervous authorities to tamp down patriotic enthusiasm. Years ago in my doctoral dissertation, I suggested that the same impulse may have been at work in Paris in 1800, but this explanation ultimately makes no sense. As I've shown, the myth of the Horatii had been so thoroughly appropriated by Bonaparte, then reveling in the success of his most recent Italian campaign, that it is difficult to understand what possible political objection the authorities could have to the scene. Even after this episode, Napoleon would remain devoted to the myth of the Horatii. In January 1804, 5 months before he assumed the title of emperor, he had David's painting installed in the Senate gallery of the Luxembourg Palace, all but elevating it to a state symbol. As late as 1810, a lavish engraving of the painting was printed in Paris with a fawning dedication to Napoléon le Grand, Napoleon the Great. It is unthinkable, then, that there were any ideological objections to Porta's oath scene in 1800. Allow me to propose another possibility. Assuming that Castilblas was right that the onstage oath was intended as the moment of the attack, is it possible that the shorter, embarrassingly bad version of the scene was specifically designed to assist in entrapping the conspirators? Spread from one side of the theater to the other, Ceracchi, Arena, and Diana would have needed some sort of signal, audible by all, in order to synchronize their attack. One can easily imagine that the three men were led to believe that, as in the long version of the scene, the swearing of the oath would be accompanied by a deafening roar of brass. From their positions in the corridors and foyer, they could easily hear this. Frankly, they could have heard it in Provence, and put their plot in motion. But if that loud cue were removed, as in the short version, they would be thrown into confusion in their places and easily apprehended with no real threat to the consuls or anyone else's safety. Under this theory, we could assume that the longer version was restored for later performances when there was no longer any reason to abbreviate the scene. It's hardly a preposterous notion. Stamford's agent reported that the police communicated directly with the manager of the opera, Anne-Pierre-Jacques Devime. Although the agent implies that the first of these communications took place the day of the performance, it is certainly possible that they began earlier. Both Fouché and Bourrienne recalled that police preparations for the plot began at least as early as mid-September. And if, as I have argued, the opera was essentially an occasional piece celebrating Bonaparte's second Italian campaign, Porta may well have been eager to help thwart the consul's enemies, even at some artistic sacrifice on his part. Obviously, a plan like this would require a great deal of coordination between a number of parties, from the first consul to the minister of police to the administration of the opera, which would suggest far greater involvement of the authorities than they were willing to acknowledge in their memoirs and in the official record. If this scheme seems needlessly elaborate and hazardous, such was precisely Bourrienne's opinion, the police, he maintained, could have taken action early on without going through what Fouché himself called a mock attempt on the life of the first consul. Far better, in Bourrienne's mind, to dispel the storm rather than avert it. Our story has three curiously rhyming epilogues. First, the season of conspiracy in late 1800 culminated in the most dangerous attack yet on the first consul, when, on Christmas Eve, a group of royalists attempted to explode his carriage on the way to the opera for the Paris premiere of Joseph Haydn's oratorio, The Creation. After the Bourbon Restoration, on the day before the Feast of St. Valentine 1820, another conspiracy of daggers successfully claimed its victim when a fanatic, this time a Bonapartist, stabbed Charles Ferdinand d'Artois, Duke of Berry, the son of the future King Charles X, as he was leaving the opera. The Duke was carried back into the theater, where he died the following morning. In consequence of this tragedy, the Théâtre des Arts was promptly closed, eventually to be demolished after the opera moved to the new Salle Pelletier in 1821. That's the previous Paris opera, not the current one that the Phantom haunts. At the opera in January 1858, the Italian revolutionary Felice Orsini and three accomplices attempted to blow up the carriage of Bonaparte's nephew, the Emperor Napoleon III. Adding irony to irony, the performance that Napoleon III had intended to see included the second act of Rossini's William Tell, whose famous conspiracy scene reproduced on stage the Revolutionary era's second most famous painting of oath-swearing, Karl van Steuben's 1824 painting, The Oath of the Three Swiss. The painting was destroyed in 1848 during the upheavals of the Revolution, so all we have today are engravings such as this one. Another excerpt on the program that evening was from D.F.E. Auber's 1833 opera Gustav III, which depicts the 1792 assassination of the Swedish king by oath-bound conspirators at a masked ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm. The attack on Napoleon III would famously complicate the genesis of an opera based on Auber's Gustav III, Giuseppe Verdi's A Masked Ball, which could only be performed after extensive censorship. Compared with this astonishing series of operatic regicidal coincidences, nothing in my theory of the 1800 case seems all that far-fetched. Thank you very much.